Well, gosh, I'm glad you could join us because tonight's show is a very important show. We have my old friend, Doug Caddy. He's not much older than me, but we've been friends a long time.
That's right.
And Doug has gone to the task of writing a biography. It's an autobiography. The overall title screams Being There, Eyewitness to History by Douglas Caddy, attorney. And as you will learn during our discussion, that there's more to Doug Caddy than just being an attorney. I suppose there's more to everybody than the profession they encounter, the job they do. But Doug has had a rich, often colorful, sometimes frightening life. And we're going to be discussing that. Doug, welcome to Papa.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to talk about my new autobiography.
And it's kind of chronological, but you deviate from that from time to time. And I could find things that were kind of, at least temporarily out of place as you were writing it. So you didn't try to do this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, but you did.
Well, that's because several of the major events bled together. They went forward and then went backwards.
And then there were things that happened in the interim period, right, and all of that. Mm-hmm. Most interesting to me was your evolution as a conservative activist. And how did that come about?
Well, I was in high school in New Orleans in 1954, Alcee Fortier High School, and that was a time that Joe McCarthy was up for being censured by the U.S. Senate for his alleged wrongdoing. And so my parents were very pro Joe McCarthy, and the newspapers carried an article. There would be a rally in the local park right there, Audubon Park, and we lived very, very close by to us. I went over to Audubon Park, and Kent and Phoebe Courtney were the organizers of the rally. And at the rally, they asked that I set up a card table in the French Quarter to collect signatures on a petition to support Joe McCarthy, which I did, right in front of St. Louis Cathedral. Joe McCarthy was Catholic. Everybody going in and out of that cathedral was Catholic, and I got lots of signatures.
Yeah, but that's the way to do that. As a matter of fact, when they were doing the traffic light camera thing,
right,
I was called in by the bail bonds people, and they invited me to do their signatures for it. And I said, why are you doing this? Why are you paying me? Why don't you go sit up at the foot of the stairs so people, after they pay their tickets, are walking out? I said, you won't miss a customer.
No, that's right.
and they got their signatures with that.
Right. But as a result of doing this little work in the French Quarter with Kent Courtney, he invited me to go to a meeting with him, a meeting with Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister was assistant superintendent of the police in Houston at that time. He was a former FBI agent, mm-hmm. one of Hoover's closest associates. Mm-hmm. And jumping forward, he was the alleged handler of Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans in the months just before the assassination.
Was he the guy that was standing there when Harvey got shot?
Lee Harvey. No, this was in New Orleans.
This was in New Orleans. Yeah. Harvey had lived in New Orleans. But let's back up just a little bit. Uh-huh. Who was Joseph McCarthy?
Well, Joe McCarthy was a strong in my opinion and my family's opinion at that time, a strong anti-communist spokesman.
From Minnesota?
No, from Wisconsin.
Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
See, I'm like Mr. Trump. I get Minnesota and Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the interesting aspect of this, right, at this time is 1954, Lee Harvey Oswald was going to high school in New Orleans. I was going to high school in New Orleans, and I was working with Guy Bannister, who was an assistant superintendent of the police. And at that time, we were within 5 minutes walking distance of each other. But none of us knew in 1954-55 that 7 or 8 years later, our lives would be entirely changed, because Lee Harvey Oswald was alleged to be the assassination of Kennedy.
Yeah.
Just before then, as I mentioned, Bannister had been his handler. And later on, I became the attorney for Howard Hunt, who was one of the people deeply involved in the assassination. As you know, he had a deathbed confession. He said he was a bench warmer, but actually he was on the grassy knoll during the assassination. But none of us knew in 1954-55 that this is the way life was going to unfold.
Well, and you were within blocks of each other. And listen, I've lived in New Orleans. A block ain't far.
No, this was Lee Harvey Oswald lived with his mother on Exchange Place, right in the heart of the French Quarter there. And Aaron Cohen, who was head of the crime commission, said this is the most dangerous street in New Orleans. More crime took place on that street than any other street.
Uh-huh.
You know,
in the hot and heavy of the French Quarter.
Yeah.
And Lee Harvey Oswald turned left.
Yes.
And you turned right.
Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that continued on entirely separate courses.
Yeah.
But how did you come to know Hunt?
Well, let me just mention one thing here. It sort of leads up to that. When I was graduating from high school, I went to Georgetown University, and I had an internship with Human Events while I was a student. And my roommate, David Frank, and I decided there was no conservative movement. And that's when we decided to form the Conservative.
Human Events
was a newsletter.
Was a newsletter, a national newsletter?
National conservative newsletter.
Conservative newsletter designed for younger people.
Well, no, it was a political newsletter. Right
General.
There, published right there on Capitol Hill. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so we formed the National Institute Committee for the Loyalty Oath in 1958, Youth for Goldwater for Vice President in 1959, and Young Americans for Freedom in 1960. So
you were a Goldwater supporter before his presidential races.
That's right. And
so how did Goldwater even emerge from Arizona? I mean, he was a clothier or something in Arizona.
His family owned a department store.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But he wrote a book called about the conservatism, which got him on the map. And then at the Republican Convention in 1960, because we were there, his advocates, he became a national figure. He made a major speech there. And there was a rally on March 4th, 1961 in Manhattan, a rally at Manhattan Center. At that time, there was no conservative movement. This was the first time the conservatives came out of the woodwork. We had over 3,000 people inside Manhattan Center and 6,000 people on the outside. And the reporter for the New York Times was prophetic. He said he quoted Goldwater as saying, "We don't know what's going to. We don't know where this is going. We don't know what we have right here. This is a movement, but we don't know what's going." And he was prophetic because that was the beginning of the conservative movement. And so, jumping ahead, how did I meet Howard Hunt? When I went to law school, and when I was graduating from law school, I went to work for General Foods Corporation. Mm-hmm. And in 1969-60, General Foods Corporation sent me to Washington, D.C. to be their Washington representative. But for the first year, I was to work out of the Mullen Company, which was their public relations firm. And 6 months after I started working out of there, a General Foods employee, Howard Hunt, joined the staff of the Mullen Company. He was retiring from the CIA.
And in that capacity, you were basically a lobbyist?
Yes, I would be a lobbyist. I was their lobbyist, the Washington representative for General Foods Corporation. And Richard Helms placed Howard Hunt there in the Mullen Company. And jumping ahead, I didn't realize until years later, in the midst of Watergate, the Mullen Company actually had been incorporated by the CIA in 1959. It was a CIA front. But General Foods did not tell me that. That was with closely held information. General Foods were working very closely with the CIA through the Mullen Company in those years. And so Howard Hunt and I started talking. We found we had Howard Hunt as a friend, because we had William F. Buckley as a friend. Okay. Because William F. Buckley had been a CIA agent under Howard Hunt in Mexico City. And for 2 years before he left to go back to Connecticut to write God at Man at Yale, his famous bestseller,
Oh, yes.
and start National Review. So that's how I met Howard Hunt.
And National Review is still in print.
Still in print. Mm-hmm.
And but the deal with William F. Buckley is that he started actually on a Pacifica radio station.
Really? In New York City?
Yeah. His later television show would first be a KPFT, not in New York City, in San Francisco.
Oh, in San Francisco.
Yeah.
Oh.
WPFA.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could send tapes.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like you could go on the internet and do a radio show from wherever you are.
Mm-hmm.
But he would do his radio show and send the tape to WPFW, and then it would be put in the Pacifica National Archives. So his earliest radio is still in Pacifica National Archives.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the beginning of a whole media developed conservative movement. Because what was the name of his show?
The Firing Line?
The Firing Line.
Firing Line.
The Firing Line.
Mm-hmm.
Other than bad posture, when it became a television show, you could see the posture was bad.
Mm-hmm.
But other than the bad posture, the content was thought-provoking, whether you agree with it or not, because it was racked in such an academic kind of fervor.
Mm-hmm.
But you were getting developed. That somewhere in here, Nick Pack and college organizations and Young Americans for Freedom came in.
Mm-hmm. Well, Young Americans for Freedom was formed at William F. Buckley's family home in 1960. Goldwater asked at the Republican convention, "Don't let your youth organization die." The one that was for him, make it permanent. And that led to the founding of Young Americans.
That was an evolution from the Goldwater movement.
And it still exists today. It's still a very powerful organization. And then I left General Foods employee and went with a law firm in Washington. Howard Hunt was my first client. And I wrote a letter at his request when he was asked to join the White House staff. Chuck Colson asked him to join the White House staff. They were both alumni of Brown University. That was their common bond. And then Howard Hunt called me about 2 hours after the burglars were arrested at Watergate to represent him and the burglars. He came to my apartment, and that's how I got involved in Watergate.
So the book kind of reveals your melding into this conservative movement, political power groups.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And the birth of conservatism, which was nothing, and which grew to be a national movement that elected presidents, and we have a president today who bears that mantle. But as far, if we met Buckley and Milton Friedman and
We could pull them all back together from their various graves.
But if they were here today, they would not be a supporter of the Trump or of Trump's conservatism. But just a few months before Watergate broke, I was asked by a partner of my law firm to be a volunteer lawyer in the Nixon campaign. He had gotten a call from George Webster, who was chairman of the Lawyers Committee. And so I met with John Dean in his office in the White House on April 25th, 1972. And so I was actually working for John Dean and the White House when Watergate broke. So
you're already in from the cold.
Yeah. But I was doing ordinary campaign legal work for them. Nothing out of the ordinary at that time.
Well, why do you think they fingered you to show up in court for the burglars?
Well, I think the only purpose of my being the attorney at that time was to get the burglars. Five burglars were arrested. Hunt and Liddy were not arrested. They escaped.
This wasn't even an arraignment hearing. This is the first hearing.
It was the arraignment hearing.
It was the arraignment hearing.
Yeah.
They were still in custody.
They had been arrested and they were in custody there, and the question was whether bail was going to be granted or not.
Yeah.
And I was retained by Howard Hunt and by Gordon Liddy, because Howard Hunt called Gordon Liddy from my apartment while he was there. This is several hours after it was about 3:30 in the morning. Okay.
Yeah.
And my purpose was to try to get these 5 burglars out on bail very quietly, get them out.
Yeah.
Get them out so that sort of nobody would notice what was going on. But what we did not know at that time was that Carl Schaffler, the arresting officer, detective, had been given information by a confidential informant 2 weeks before the break-in about the plan for the break-in. His confidential informant had his own method, had his own confidential informant who had overheard a conversation on the telephone and told him what he had overheard.
So the cat was out of the bag before the door locks were taped.
That's right. That's right.
Well, that makes a arraignment lawyer a difficult job.
Very, very difficult. And Carl Schaffler was a military intelligence officer, and who was assigned to the Washington, D.C. police. And he and Bob Woodward went through the same NSA school, the Vent Hill Farm School, to learn how to do wiretapping and so forth together. This is in the years before Watergate. And so they knew each other. And so Carl Schaffler left military intelligence to go in the Washington, D.C. police, and Bob Woodward left military intelligence. He was liaison from the Pentagon to the White House before he left the Pentagon, and he went to the Washington Post. So how convenient it was that the detective who arrested the burglars had a relationship with Bob Woodward, the reporter who ultimately won the Pulitzer Prize, along with Carl Bernstein for.
Well, you impressed Woodward and Bernstein.
Yes.
You show up in a bell-bottom suit.
Yes.
In the book. Yes. I read it.
Yeah. Yeah. But it was an awkward moment there. My partner in my law firm had arranged for a criminal lawyer, so a lawyer skilled in criminal law, because we were a labor law firm.
Yeah.
We did no criminal law at all. And so I met this, Joseph Rafferty was his name. I met him before the arraignment, and the agreement was he's going to do all the public speaking. I would just be behind the scenes. But
yeah.
But the question arose: why was I there? And Rafferty, or why we were there? And Rafferty just went like this. He went like this, and suddenly I was put on the spot. Okay.
Yeah.
I could not very well say I got a call from Howard Hunt from the White House.
No. That violates client privilege.
And who came to my apartment and asked me to represent those being arraigned here today. That would let the cat out of the bag, because nobody knew that Howard Hunt.
Well, did you want to get out at that point?
No, I didn't know. Well, I didn't even think about it at that time. There was too much going on, you know. But I couldn't very well say, you know, that I could not say publicly to Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt were clients of mine and were major players in what had occurred, because nobody knew at that time. It took a whole month before that hit the Washington Post as a front page story.
Howard Hunt was in Dallas when Kennedy was assassinated.
Howard Hunt, there's a question. There's very serious allegations and some evidence that he was the paymaster for the Cuban Americans who were in Dallas at that time. Frank Sturgis was one of the assassins. Frank Sturgis, one of the Cuban Americans.
Sure.
And Frank Sturgis gave a confession to Cardinal Cook in 1971, in which he had a 31-page confession of all the murders he had committed, all the crimes he had committed, everything he had done on behalf of our government, and so forth. And among the things he recounted in that confession, that handwritten confession, was being one of the assassinations on Grassy Knoll, and Howard Hunt was his
paymaster.
Howard was his
picking up the bills. Picking up the bills.
Well, he was paying, but he was also the spotter for Sturgis, standing next to Sturgis, a spotter for this.
A spotter and a shooting deal.
A shooting deal. So
that's pretty tight stuff for somebody in Howard Hunt's position at that time.
Well, he didn't. You know, he gave a deathbed confession. He said was, in which he identified the key players from the CIA who were involved in the assassination.
Okay, is there any separation between, because this has come up a couple of times in this conversation, between the CIA and the conservative movement, or is that all so commingled?
Oh, they're not commingled at all. Not commingled at all. No.
No, because I watched a CIA honcho on television today, and he is this pleasant talking, gentle-mannered guy who was in conflict with the current president. But the current president is not conservative at all.
Right. Well, Howard Hunt, among the people he named as being involved in the assassination in his deathbed confession was Cord Meyer, and Cord Meyer was a well-known liberal. So you have all sorts of philosophies held by
whatever flavor they need.
And so my role became controversial fairly quickly, and not only at the arraignment, but on June 28th, which was 11 days after the break-in, I was served with a subpoena to appear forthwith before the grand jury. And I ultimately appeared 6 times before the grand jury. I had my financial records subpoenaed. And I was held in contempt of court by Judge Sirica. He accused me of being a major player in the crime, a participant in the crime.
You were the guy in the courtroom with a bar card. I mean,
beg pardon now?
You were the guy in the courtroom with a bar card.
Well, no, no. I mean, you don't accuse a defense lawyer falsely of being a
no, you don't do that.
Yeah.
That's what I was saying.
Well, it was very shocking to me and to my the partners in my law firm. And so I refused to answer 38 questions before the grand jury upon instruction of I had 5 attorneys at that point. And I was held in contempt of court by Judge Sirica on July 13th, 1972. The Court of Appeals released me pending an appeal. Ultimately, they upheld Judge Sirica's decision and ordered me to testify or be incarcerated at that point. And this is discussed by President Nixon and Ehrlichman in the Oval Office tapes as to what should be done with me. And I did testify before the grand jury. It was decided everything we had laid a record that the defendants would probably be freed ultimately because of what Judge Sirica and the Court of Appeals had done to me and forced me to testify about things that were covered by the attorney-client privilege and the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. But jumping ahead, what happened was Dorothy Hunt was killed in December in that plane crash in Dallas. And in January, Howard Hunt pleaded guilty. So all the work that I had done on his behalf in being held in contempt of court and fighting on behalf of the attorney-client privilege and so forth, the Sixth Amendment, became sort of lost because he pleaded guilty. And the Cuban Americans followed him. That just left James McCord and Gordon Liddy to stand trial. And I did testify. I was a witness for the government and for the defense at the first Watergate trial. But the jury quickly...
So you had a split personality.
Right.
Defense witness and the government witness.
And the jury quickly found those 2 defendants guilty.
The title of the book is Being There, Eyewitness to History by Douglas Caddy. And we've been talking about some of its content, and I know the interview may be confusing to Doug, but it's making sense to me because it would be nice if something we said here seduced you to study this fascinating period of history. There are probably other places you can get this history, but not from the eyewitness perspective. Douglas, somehow or other you made it to Texas. How did that happen?
Well, my family resided in Houston at that point in time and during Watergate, and so I decided in 1970.
Did you come here on the lam?
In a sense. I decided that Washington was no longer a place I wanted to be. It had become a swamp in a different sense of the word, And so I came to Texas in 1979, and I went to work in the Governor Clements administration for George Strait, the Secretary of State.
Sure.
I was a director of elections, and I traveled to almost all the counties in Texas. There are 254 counties in Texas.
Yeah.
I went to so many of them in the 1980 election, because at that time there were six machines used in Texas to vote. Yeah. And I went there to teach
people how to use those
machines. Okay, and then that's how I ultimately became involved with the Moody Foundation, and that evolved into
now so that people put this in perspective. Sherman Moody is an insurance heir of what used to be called American General Insurance. It's now AIG, and the office over here on the Allen Parkway in Houston. It's an enormous corporation.
No, actually it's still Anaco. Anaco is the insurance company.
Okay.
Which is still in Galveston.
Okay, and so the headquarters of Sherman's insurance company is still in Galveston.
Yes, that's right.
And they wanted to branch out.
American National Insurance Company.
And they wanted to branch out.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so they went into business in Alabama, and there was a famous suit.
Well, Sherman had his own private insurance company, separate from Anaco. Anaco was the one that actually is controlled by the Moody Foundation. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so that's a whole different story. But of Sherman's problems with his insurance company was stolen by the insurance commissioners in Alabama, and but how I got involved was Howard Phillips, who was a conservative leader in Washington, called me and said that the Moody Foundation, Sherman Moody, wanted to give a grant to one of his organizations, but it had to be done to a Texas corporation. It could not be done out of state. So I incorporated the Texas Policy Institute. I left George Strait's office and became counselor to that organization. And as a result, I started working with Sherman Moody. There were only 3 trustees of the Moody Foundation.
Every Boy Scout in Texas in my lifetime is a big fan of George Strait.
George Strait is he and his
remarkable Boy Scout.
Right.
He had camps.
Camp Strait and the hospital downtown here, St. Joseph, the Strait building. Strait Jesuit High School. I mean, he's done wonderful things.
And Bill Clements was quite a character.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he was.
Bill Clements was quite a character. I knew him. He offered me a pardon one time.
Really?
Yeah, and I turned him down.
You turned down a pardon?
I said,
How many people turned down a pardon?
I said, Governor, I appreciate that. And I didn't expect it to come from you. I thought it'd come from the next Democratic governor. But, but I'm going to turn it down because it's not about me getting a pardon so I can vote. It's about getting the voting rights of Texas inmates restored when they have completed their time. I turned him down. And he thought we were shocked about that.
Because you want to concentrate on getting legislation passed?
Right.
And you felt if you got a pardon that would compromise your ability to do so, is that it? Or?
Well, I didn't want it to be a private fix. I wanted it to affect everybody.
Sure.
And ultimately, Clemens respected that.
Yeah. So you got the ability to vote as everybody else did because of your efforts.
Yes, because of my efforts, getting the legislature to pass it, and because of Bill White's, who also offered me a pardon that I turned down.
Wow.
And Bill White's generosity. He told me during the campaign that he wasn't going to sign the bill.
How many people are affected by that? How many voters are there who have a record, a criminal record?
At least 140,000 living human beings can vote because of the Ray Hill bill.
In Texas?
In Texas.
Isn't that amazing? That's fantastic, really. Mm-hmm. Really.
I wish I could get them all names on the list and tell them how to vote, but that's not within my purview.
Right, right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
But you know how to do that kind of politics.
Well,
you know how to use the list.
Yeah, in a sense, yes. But so I started working with Sherman Moody, and this led to my working with Billy Sol Estes, because while I had just started working with Sherman Moody, but he got a call from Jimmy Day, his former lobbyist, who was incarcerated with Billy Sol in federal prison in Midland, Texas, and Jimmy Day had left the employment of Sherman Moody and gone to Washington, and he went to the White House for an occasion, and he stole stationery from the White House and proceeded to write letters of recommendation saying, this man is, you can't
Genius. Yeah, well, that's Billy Sol. Billy Sol's that good.
Well, no, this was Jimmy Day.
Jimmy Day. Jimmy Day is another. They run in packs.
But that's why they were together on the phone. And Jimmy Day said, I want to give the phone to Billy Sol. And Billy Sol said, well, this is in 1983. And Billy Sol is in prison there in Midland, Texas. And he's saying, I want to tell my story. Lyndon Johnson died in 1971. And in the midst of the first Watergate trial.
Yeah.
And he said, I want a Moody Foundation grant to help me tell my story. So Sherman Moody asked me to go up and meet with Billy Sol, which I did, and I said, well, write a book. He said, I'll think about it. I met with him in prison. I said, write a book, that's the way to do it. And so what he did, he gave the idea to his daughter, Pam, and she wrote a book, Billy Sol Estes, The King of the Wheeler Dealers, which was a big hit. But all it contained were stories about the family, what they endured while he went to prison twice, you know, for his
Day or Sol Estes?
Well, it was Billy Sol Estes.
Okay.
Pam Estes wrote about the family's life when Billy Sol was incarcerated. Jimmy Day, he passed out of the picture at that point once I met with Billy Sol. But Billy Sol did get out at the end of 1983, and he contacted Sherman Moody again and said, I want to write the book. And Sherman Moody sent me up to Abilene to meet with Billy Sol. And I said, and Sherman Moody had told me that we need a tax-exempt entity to give the grant. And Billy Sol said, I can get the Abilene Christian University to do that, because he was a Church of Christ member, as was my mother. I was actually raised in the Church of Christ myself.
Okay.
So I'm an Episcopalian now. And so we went over there to the Abilene Christian University, and the way the grant would be structured by the Moody Foundation would be a $500,000 grant, of which $400,000 would go to the university for whatever purpose they wanted, and $100,000 would go to Billy Sol for him to do his research and writing of his story. But then Billy Sol told me that in order to, even before the grant was approved, the grant actually was never approved because of an action of Billy Sol. He said he needed immunity from prosecution for all the murders that were involved. He didn't detail the murders at that time. And so there were many crimes. So I was working with Edward Miller, a former assistant director of the FBI at that time, who was a consultant on the Moody Foundation grant. And he arranged for the two of us to see Stephen Trott, who was the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division in the Justice Department. This was in 1984, about getting Billy Sol immunity. And Stephen Trott arranged for the FBI to go back into the records and see if there was justification for doing this. And they said, yes, let's do this. And so they asked for a proffer letter as to what Billy Sol Estes would testify to, or what information he could give. But ultimately what happened was Billy Sol was working with Clint Peoples, who was a U.S. Marshal for the Northern District of Texas. He was a former Texas Ranger. And Clint Peoples arranged for him in 1984 to testify before the Robertson County Grand Jury about the murder of Henry Marshall, who was a Department of Agriculture employee who was murdered in 1961. And Billy Sol testified that it was upon orders of Lyndon Johnson that Henry Marshall, the Department of Agriculture employee, was murdered because he had come upon Billy Sol Estes' storage tanks that were false storage tanks.
Yeah, grain elevators.
Yeah, and other activities of which LBJ was involved with Billy Sol Estes. And so it became, at that point, the president of Abilene Christian University said, oh, well, this is far, far from something we want to be involved in. We had no idea that this is going in this direction. So they withdrew being the entity, you know. And so the grant never went through. But what happened was the FBI agents flew down from Washington to meet with Billy Sol to pursue the grant of immunity. And I met with Billy Sol in the lobby of a hotel in Abilene. It was like a hotel with a lobby that went up 12 different stories. Okay. So the
Atrium lobby.
So the FBI could look down, and Billy Sol came in to meet with me in the lobby with his daughter, and at that point he said, "It's all off." I said, I'm not going to testify. I'm not going to work. I'm not going to pursue this any further. I'm not going to meet with the FBI agents. I'm not going to do anything. Thank you very much. And I engaged in conversation with him a little bit more, and then he said, I'm leaving, and that was the end. And in his autobiography, he says that he decided not to pursue it because when he was incarcerated, and he was incarcerated with top mafia figures,
Yeah.
he bonded with them, he being a notorious swindler himself.
Sure.
And he said, I've been contacted by these mafia people. He says that in his autobiography, and they strongly discouraged me from.
And a strong discouragement of the mafia pays off.
Yeah. So that's why it ended at that point.
If you're watching the show now, we do have telephone capacity. There's a telephone number that'll appear periodically. You can call in and ask a question that I didn't ask, or you can take Doug down some of these fascinating trails. Doug Caddy has led a very fascinating life, and if you see him out there taking care of the neighborhood cats and feeding the ducks in the park, he seems to be a little more passive guy than the stories he has to tell would indicate.
Well, I should wrap up my relationship with Sherm Moody as to how it ended, so to speak, which led to the Moody Foundation scandal in about 1985 and 86, because I was visiting Sherm Moody in North Carolina, where he was undergoing medical problems, medical treatment over there for his medical problems. Mm-hmm. And he asked me to meet with James Brewer, who was a representative of the FBI, and James Brewer asked if I would go undercover for the FBI to get, the FBI believed the Insurance Commission of the state of Alabama was engaged in allegedly corrupt activities, and among them stealing Sherm Moody's insurance company. Mm-hmm. And so I pointed out that all my work had been with the tax-exempt organizations. I had not got involved in Sherm Moody's legal problems, his personal legal problems, but the FBI felt that I could be of assistance, and so I did. I got a letter of understanding from the FBI, and so did Sherm Moody, and so we proceeded. I proceeded to work with the FBI on this project, but then unbeknownst to the FBI and to me, Sherm Moody and his brother were involved in bankruptcy fraud. Sherm Moody had filed for bankruptcy, and they converted an instrument in the bankruptcy estate illegally, and this led to, later on, to Sherm Moody's being
incarcerated,
indicted and convicted for bankruptcy fraud. But when it was disclosed that he had converted this instrument in bankruptcy, and to the FBI and to me, we both withdrew. I had to withdraw from having any contact with Sherm Moody because it was sort of like what had happened with Howard Hunt. Mm-hmm. I mean, you stay around these people, you're going to get caught up in their.
Trying to lay down with dogs, you get up with fleas.
And so I withdrew, and Sherm Moody, as a result, I went down to the Moody Foundation and told him what was going on between Sherm Moody and people he was involved in. These William Papps, who's still a federal fugitive to this day. And as a result, at the trial, there's testimony that Sherm Moody was mad enough at me that I blew the whistle to the Moody Foundation about what was going on, that he actually...
yeah, he was more afraid of Robert than he was the FBI.
Yeah.
And Mary.
And Aunt Mary, those were the three trustees of the Moody Foundation. So that's how that ended. But we did some wonderful things. Sherm Moody did some wonderful things through the grants he gave to me, basically. The first one was we had the Star Wars conference in Galveston about the Star Wars, even before President Reagan announced it. Yeah. And another Moody Foundation grant, we held the first national conference on the emerging role of the Hispanic community in American society. Nobody was talking in the early 1980s about the emerging role of the Hispanic community. The Hispanic community was on the verge of becoming a very powerful part of American society. We put on a very important national conference there. And in 1985, our last conference was on terrorism. Nobody was talking about terrorism, but we put on a national conference on terrorism here in Houston, and people from all over the world came to attend our conference. It was actually organized by Edward Miller. We retained him as our consultant. He was a former assistant director of the FBI, and he knew how to put this. He knew exactly how to put
these big things together.
Put it together. And so we did some wonderful work before it all collapsed. Okay, and but in between these, there are other periods that there were things I were involved in. We might mention here, right after Watergate came Koreagate. Koreagate was actually a major scandal, and it involved my roommate from college, Tongsun Park. Tongsun Park was the first person, when I went to Georgetown University, the School of Foreign Service, in 1956, the first person I met was Tongsun Park. We registered together.
There was the president of Korea by the name of Park.
There were a lot of people in Korea named Park,
Okay.
but there was a president, okay. And Tongsun and I became very close friends. We became class officers, and as a result of the formation of Young Americans for Freedom, he was living in Washington at that time, and he conceived forming an international organization for freedom, of Youth for Freedom, patterned after Young Americans for Freedom. And this led to the Korean CIA, this is in the 1970s, giving him money, because at that time they were very worried. This is part of the Koreagate scandal. The Korea government was very worried that we were going to withdraw our troops from Korea. Now, does this ring a bell today? This is this was 1976.
Yeah. Well, that is
It hasn't died. It's still around.
The Korean situation is an evolution that never ends.
Right, and so Tongsun Park became the bagman, so to speak. He got this money from the Korean CIA. He gave it to dozens of members of Congress as contributions, political contributions to their campaigns and so forth.
To get their votes on issues that are important.
To make sure that the troops were not withdrawn.
Okay.
Okay, and almost all of them were Democrats, because it was
who has in power?
No, it was actually it was still under
Nixon.
Nixon, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But and the only Congressman Hanna of California was the only congressman that went to prison. About 10 or 12 congressmen did not run for re-election. But that was that scandal, okay? And because I was on the board of directors of that organization, though I was going to law school at that time in New York City and not an active participant, I was caught up with it. And I was asked to appear before the House Committee investigating Koreagate. And so I went down there and met with them and to the staff, and they said, did Tongsun Park ever ask you to introduce him to a member of Congress? I said, no, I couldn't think of anybody. And they said, well, what about Martin McNeely? And I said, well, I did introduce him to Martin McNeely, but that was when I was working for Governor Rockefeller while I was going to law school. That was years and years before. Yeah. And so he said, excuse me, and he left the room. The staff guy left the room, but there was a big file there about an inch thick. It said Douglas Caddy's file. I said, Douglas Caddy's file? What could be that? It was just a false file, but it was to see if I would reach over there, see what was in that file. And so I didn't do it, obviously. I mean, I realized what it was, a setup. And so the staff guy came back in with his director of the staff, and they said, well, you're going to be our first witness at the public hearings on Koreagate. And I said, I am. I said, I'm shocked, and I said, I'll agree to be your first witness, but I'll tell you what I'm going to say in my opening statement. I said, this is just like Watergate. You're going to concentrate on the little fish, like me, while the big fish escape. That's what this will be all about. And that's what I'll say in my opening statement. And they said, well, thank you very much.
Be the witness.
Thank you very much. Maybe we won't need you as a witness after all. You're excused. That was the last I heard from that.
So calling the bluff of these major bureaucrats has an upside as well. Douglas Caddy, at one point, you begin to drift from the ideology of the ultra-conservative.
Yes, this was about 1974, right in the midst of Nixon's resignation period. And that's because Joe Kors came to Washington to meet with, he showed up actually a meeting unannounced and uninvited with Edward Fuller and another individual. and demanded that the Schuckman Foundation, which was, Bob Schuckman was the first chairman of Young Americans for Freedom. He was a student at Yale University. That we do their bidding, that they put their funds in our organization and we do their bidding.
Was
and the
a
directors
hostile takeover?
They wanted that, but there were only 3 directors present at that meeting, and we all said no. And so they left, but they vowed they would destroy us. They tried to destroy us after that. But that was our first meeting. Paul Weyrich was a third individual there with Edward Filner and Joe Kors. And so they formed the Heritage Foundation right afterwards, and that's, as you know, became a very powerful organization. Sure. But that opened my eyes, and that was the beginning. And that was the beginning of the of where Nixon and those people who have nothing in common with Joe Kors and with this radical right that has now taken over complete control, the Tea Party, complete control of the Republican Party.
Actually, Nixon was pretty smart.
Nixon was very smart. In many ways, you know, he formed the Environmental Protection Agency, Office of Economic Opportunity. He wanted a health program. There were many things that, you know, he would be, today he'd probably be, as would William F. Buckley, he'd be a card-carrying member of the ACLU. Yeah. He would not find anything in common with these people.
Well, isn't it interesting to you how we perceive people in their time and then have to perceive them differently later?
Exactly. Isn't it interesting? It is fascinating.
And you and I have Joe Kors in common. Joe Kors flew all the way to Houston at one point and surrendered to me on the radio.
Really?
Well, I'd boycotted him.
Oh, the Coors beer boycott?
Beer boycott. The gay community's Coors beer boycott.
Right.
Put one of his Houston distributors out of business.
Wow.
And Joe Kors realized how much beer gay people drink. Mm-hmm. And so he, in a private jet, flew into Powers, Mel Powers' private jet thing over here at Hobby. And he limousine to KPFT and came in and gave me his sword on the air.
Wow.
I had asked for 3 resolutions from the board, signatures by the board chairman and the president, and I got all that, and Howard Wallace never forgave me. He said, "Why did you stop the boycott?" I said, "When a man walks in and gives you everything you ask for and offers your sword, my mama told me be polite enough to receive it."
Okay. So strategically, it turned out to be the right thing to do.
Absolutely, it was the right thing to do. I mean, the man surrendered, and gay people didn't suffer employment discrimination in Golden, Colorado, or anywhere in the network. And of course, still pays for Pride Week events all over the country.
Right. Well, that meeting of the Schuckman Foundation, where Kors showed up with Paul Weyrich and Edwin Fulner, and the formation of the Heritage Foundation, that was the beginning of the takeover of the Republican Party by these radical right extremists, who are really they're the oligarchs that employ these people. A lot of these conservatives that I knew in those days have become they've led a very pleasant life because they've been paid very well by these oligarchs, the right-wing oligarchs.
Yeah, when I heard that Dick Armey was buying up copies of Saul Alinsky's Reveille for Radicals, I said, wait a minute, this ain't gonna work. Saul Alinsky doesn't fit into a well-funded organization. Right. If you're going to be a Saul Alinsky activist, which I am one of the best in the country, if you're going to be a Saul Alinsky activist, you come from Hungary. And that's not a country, that's a state of being.
Is Saul Alinsky's writings and philosophy as effective and relevant today as when he wrote it and espoused it?
Well, he didn't say anything about the internet, and that's unfortunate, but neither did Marshall McLuhan. I've had to learn that on my own. Right. But my activism is based on Saul Alinsky principle. That's where I gather a rabble together. My activism is based on the writings of Malcolm X. You decide who you're trying to help, and you don't care what other people think about them. You only care what they think about themselves. And that's where the power is. And then, of course, I'm going to give a talk this coming Sunday at the Wirt Road Universalist Unitarian Fellowship. about how to make change.
How to make change.
How to make change.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to have a voice and a vehicle to carry it. And you have to keep your eye on the prize. You have to be convinced of the worthiness of your cause. And you've got to decide who that is going to benefit and who that is going to hurt. And you have to be willing to sacrifice those that it will hurt to benefit those who will benefit. And you have to keep your eye on the prize.
So have you done this in your public life?
I've given, oh yes, and I've given this speech
Okay.
50 times.
Okay. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Well, Sol Estes was a big part of Obama's life, was it
Sure.
not? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He was an organizer for...
Well, Obama was a community organizer,
Right.
and you can't be a community organizer without going to a school of social work.
Mm-hmm.
And at the University of Houston and in Northwestern University,
Mm-hmm.
School of Social Work are both of those are Sol Estes schools.
Really?
Yeah.
University of Houston.
University of Houston.
Wow.
And I lecture there frequently.
Mm-hmm.
University of Houston is a TMO school. There are two branches of Sol Estes. TMO is the Metropolitan Organization, which is kind of middle class reformers.
Oh.
The get your hands dirty kind is called Acorn, and they killed off Acorn
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
over voter registration.
Mm-hmm.
I've been talking for the last hour to Doug Caddy. And Doug Caddy's book, Being There, Eyewitness to History, and the eye is there and it never blinks. And it's the autobiography of Doug Caddy. Doug, I'm proud you wrote this book. I'm proud to be your friend.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'll point out that it starts in 1954 when I was in New Orleans going to high school with Guy Bannister and Oswald being nearby, right up to today, because the last chapter is about my giving information to FBI Director Comey and later on to Special Counsel Mueller about the Trump-Russia scandal, about the role of Roger Stone in it, first-hand information.
Now that stuff is bubbling up in the news today.
So my eyewitness history runs from 1954 right up to the present time.
To current.
And I'm 80 years old. So I don't know whether there's anything in the future that's going to happen.
Of course there is. Of course there is. If you don't have something to do when you get up in the morning, you're not going to make it through the day. And you and I are going to have something to do.
Right, right.
The world needs a lot of fixing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
For a lot of different causes and a lot of different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got journeyman status. You name me the issue, I'll tell you how to organize around it.
Really?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's an important thing to do.
Uh-huh. What do you think about the movement for about mass incarceration?
Well, I've been working on that for the last few years because my other field, of course, is criminal justice reform.
Uh-huh.
I'm an ex-convict. I went to prison sentence to 160 years, but I was able to work my way out of prison with a pencil in 4 years, 4 months, and 17 days. That's been 43 years ago. And in that 43 years, I built an empire, prison reform. Mm-hmm. The prison show is iconic, all over the world, famous. Mm-hmm. I've retired from that, and I still do execution watch. Because I don't think anybody else wants to do that.
Mm-hmm. That's on local Pacifica station?
Pacifica Radio, and I'm the founder of KPFT.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When I say you got to have a voice and a vehicle to carry it, if you can't find one, build your own, and that's what I did.
Well, part of your organization activity, didn't you found other entities here in Houston?
Oh, mm-hmm. Everything in the gay community has got my signature on it.
Mm-hmm.
Everything started as an organization.
Okay.
And it grew out of an event called Town Meeting 1.
Town Meeting 1. And what year was that?
That was 1978.
Okay.
And the organizations, I'm a parliamentarian. So I wrote the bylaws. What was once Montrose Clinic is now Legacy Healthcare Services.
Really?
It has 7 locations throughout Houston and a new one opening in Beaumont soon.
Wow. Marvelous.
And that grew out of Montrose Clinic, an STD clinic for gay people. Montrose Counseling Center, which is a group of analyst counseling, is now Montrose Center. It's the virtual community center. And there are people swapping and changing offices, and it's a center of the community. Montrose Sports Association, out of which grew lesbian softball, which I think become a religion.
Yeah.
But
Because they play on Sunday?
oh yes, yes, and they're very serious about softball. Life can be interesting, and we're going to survive these Trump years. We've got a lot of rebuilding to do, and it's going to take most of us, especially those of us who have seen the darker and the lighter sides of history, to rebuild after this debacle. And Doug Caddy is a friend of mine, and we'll work together with your help to rebuild a freer, more just and equitable society. How could you go wrong? Doug Caddy, thank you.
And thank you, and I agree with your closing statement right there. That's wonderful.
Good night. We'll be back next time, whenever that is.